A new police chief enters his precinct incognito, determined to uncover the unfiltered reality of his officer's behavior. But when a smug officer humiliates him, thinking he's just a drifter, the station is about to experience a revelation that will shake them to their core. It was an overcast Monday morning when Marcus Taylor, the newly appointed police chief, stepped out of his car in Harbor Point, a quaint coastal town shadowed by whispers of corruption and misconduct. Dressed in a faded sweatshirt, well-worn jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days, he looked nothing like the man who had spent 2 decades climbing the ranks of law enforcement. This was deliberate. Marcus wasn't here to make a grand entrance or revel in rehearsed applause. He was here to see the precinct as it truly was. No pretenses, no masks. As the salty ocean breeze swept through the parking lot, officers milled about, their chatter intermingling with the hum of cars and the occasional clatter of coffee cups. This was exactly what Marcus had hoped for. He had spent 20 years in law enforcement, climbing the ranks with grit and determination, defying stereotypes as a black man in a field still fraught with systemic bias. Now, as Harbor Point's newly appointed police chief, he was here to lead a precinct that had been whispered about in the media for its questionable practices. With a deep breath, Marcus adjusted his baseball cap and stepped out of his car. His clothes, chosen deliberately, made him appear ordinary, someone who could easily blend into the backdrop of daily life. The slight chill in the air was refreshing against his skin, a small comfort as he prepared for what lay ahead. The precinct building loomed before him, its beige brick facade weathered but sturdy. As Marcus walked toward the side entrance, he passed a group of officers chatting near the patrol cars. They didn't spare him more than a passing glance. If anyone thought he looked out of place, they didn't say so. Inside, the precinct buzzed with activity, the faint hum of ringing phones, muffled voices carrying through the halls, and the occasional sharp laugh from somewhere down the corridor. Marcus moved quietly, taking in every detail. The tiled floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, their reflection revealing the hurried footsteps of officers coming and going. Bulletin boards were crowded with notices, wanted posters, and community announcements. As he walked past open office doors and bustling desks, he noted the unspoken hierarchy: seasoned officers holding court with their younger colleagues, administrative staff hunched over keyboards, and groups huddled around case files or donuts. No one seemed to notice Marcus as he moved deeper into the precinct. He paused near the break room, leaning casually against the doorframe. A few officers inside were laughing, trading stories about their weekends. One joked about a traffic stop that had ended with an irate motorist storming off in defeat. Another mimicked a suspect's desperate excuses, drawing chuckles from his colleagues. It was in this moment, as Marcus observed the camaraderie tinged with a subtle edge of bravado, that he felt the weight of his mission pressing on him. Harbor Point needed a culture shift, a transformation. It was a task he knew would be met with resistance, but it was a challenge he had prepared for his entire career. He turned to leave the break room and continue his observation, but the sharp scrape of a chair across the floor caught his attention. "Hey, you!" Marcus turned slowly, meeting the sharp gaze of Officer Carter. The man stood tall, his broad frame clad in a crisp uniform that seemed to amplify his presence. His blond hair was neatly cropped, and a faint sneer played on his lips. A few other officers trailed behind him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "You lost or something?" Carter asked, his tone laced with condescension. "No," Marcus replied simply, his voice calm but firm. "Just looking around." Carter chuckled, glancing over his shoulder at the small group gathering behind him. "Looking around? This isn't some community center. You got business here, or are you just wandering?" The onlookers snickered, leaning casually against the walls as if settling in for a show. Marcus felt their eyes on him, waiting to see how this would play out. "I'm not causing any trouble," Marcus said evenly, his gaze steady. "Just trying to get a feel for the place." Carter's sneer deepened. "A feel for the place? Let me guess, thinking of filing a complaint, or maybe you're here to beg for a favor?" The laughter behind Carter grew louder. Marcus noted the faces in the crowd, a young officer with uncertainty in his eyes, a pair of veterans exchanging knowing smirks, and a woman trying unsuccessfully to stifle her amusement. This wasn't just a group of colleagues, it was a hierarchy of power and complicity. "Do I look like I'm here to beg for anything?" Marcus asked, his tone calm but razor-sharp. The question caught Carter off guard for a moment, but he recovered quickly, stepping closer. "You look like you're in the wrong place. This precinct doesn't have time for freeloaders." Carter's voice rose, drawing more attention as nearby conversations hushed. The weight of the moment pressed against Marcus's chest, but he refused to let it show. "I suggest you turn around and head back where you came from," Carter continued, his voice tinged with mock authority. "We don't need your kind hanging around." Marcus's jaw tightened. He wasn't new to this kind of hostility. It was a bitter reality he had faced countless times in his career. Still, there was something uniquely jarring about experiencing it here, in a place meant to uphold justice and fairness. As Marcus prepared to respond, Carter did something unexpected. Without warning, he stepped closer, leaned in, and spat in Marcus's face. The warm spit landed on Marcus's cheek, and for a split second the world seemed to freeze. The laughter from the crowd swelled, echoing through the corridor like a cruel symphony. Someone slapped their knee, another muttered, "He deserved it." And Carter stood tall, his chest puffed out in a display of dominance. Marcus didn't flinch. Slowly, methodically, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. He dabbed at his cheek, his movements deliberate and measured, refusing to let his composure crack. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but cutting. "Only the ones who don't belong," Carter replied, his smirk widening. The crowd erupted into another wave of laughter, but Marcus barely registered it. His gaze remained locked on Carter, unflinching and resolute. Without another word, Marcus folded the handkerchief, placed it back in his pocket, and turned to walk away. His deliberate steps carried him down the hallway, past the murmuring officers whose laughter had begun to falter. The tension in the air was palpable, as Marcus's silence left an unsettling void. He didn't need to say anything. His calm demeanor spoke volumes. Behind him, Carter watched with a mix of confusion and triumph. "That's right, keep walking," he called after Marcus, though his voice lacked the same confidence it had carried moments before. The officers standing nearby exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, some of them seemed to question the scene they had just witnessed. Marcus continued toward the main office, his heart pounding not from anger, but from the determination boiling beneath his calm exterior. He reached the intercom near the door and pressed the button. "All personnel, report to the briefing room immediately." His voice crackled through the building, steady and authoritative. He released the button and stepped back, exhaling deeply. The weight of what had just happened settled over him, but so did the anticipation of what was about to come. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment to reveal who he really was, and to begin reshaping the precinct's broken culture. The tension of the encounter still lingered as Marcus entered the briefing room through a side door. The officers were filing in, chatting and laughing, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break. Carter was among them, leaning casually against the wall with a smug expression, still basking in the aftermath of his morning performance. Marcus adjusted his jacket, the sharp lines of his formal attire now a stark contrast to his earlier appearance. He picked up the folder bearing the precinct's official seal and stepped toward the podium, ready to make an introduction no one would forget. The briefing room hummed with casual chatter as officers filtered in. Some carried steaming coffee mugs while others exchanged jokes, their laughter bouncing off the sterile walls. The atmosphere was relaxed, business as usual, completely unprepared for the moment that was about to unfold. Officer Carter leaned against the back wall, his arms crossed, his smug grin still firmly in place. He relished the laughter of his colleagues, basking in the lingering glow of his morning performance. To him, the nameless man he'd humiliated earlier had already been forgotten, a fleeting distraction in an otherwise ordinary day. At the front of the room, Captain Harris, a stout, gray-haired man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stood near the podium. He cleared his throat, calling for order. The officers gradually quieted, their conversations tapering off as they settled into their seats. "All right, everyone, settle down," Harris began, his voice cutting through the room. "We've got an important announcement this morning. I need your full attention." The room stilled, the officers now curious. Harris scanned the crowd, his expression unreadable. "As most of you know, Chief Anderson retired last month," he continued. "We've been waiting for his replacement, and today I'm pleased to introduce our new Chief of Police." A ripple of whispers ran through the room, officers exchanging glances. Most hadn't expected the announcement to happen today, and they were eager to see who would take the helm. The side door creaked open and Marcus Taylor stepped inside. Gone were the scuffed sneakers and faded sweatshirt. Now Marcus wore a sharp, tailored suit, the badge of authority gleaming on his chest. He walked with purpose, his polished shoes echoing against the tiled floor. The chatter died instantly, replaced by a heavy silence. The officers stared, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief. Recognition flickered across their faces. For some, it came slowly, a dawning realization as they connected the man in front of them to the stranger in the hallway. For others, like Carter, it hit like a punch to the gut. Marcus approached the podium, his presence commanding the room. He placed a folder bearing the precinct's seal on the lectern and let his gaze sweep across the crowd. His silence was deliberate, his calm demeanor amplifying the weight of the moment. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and resolute. "My name is Marcus Taylor, and as of today, I am your new Chief of Police." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The room froze, the tension palpable. Carter's face drained of color, his smirk vanishing as he slumped slightly against the wall. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence replaced by a collective unease. Marcus let the silence linger, observing their reactions. His gaze landed on Carter for a beat longer than necessary, and the officer squirmed under the weight of it. Then Marcus returned his attention to the room. "This morning I arrived in plain clothes," Marcus continued, his tone calm but sharp. "I wanted to see this department as it truly is. Unfiltered, without the rehearsed politeness that often accompanies a new leader's arrival." He paused, letting his words sink in. What I witnessed was eye-opening. A murmur rippled through the crowd, quickly silenced as Marcus raised a hand. His expression remained composed, but his eyes carried a fire that demanded attention. "In my short time here, I experienced behaviors that are not only unprofessional but outright unacceptable," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "Behaviors that reflect a culture that has been allowed to fester unchecked." Carter shifted uncomfortably, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Marcus's gaze swept the room again, taking in the officers who avoided eye contact and those who stared back with a mixture of guilt and apprehension. "I am here to make one thing clear," Marcus declared, his voice rising slightly. "The culture of disrespect, prejudice, and arrogance that has taken root in this precinct ends today." The silence was deafening. Even the air seemed to hold still as Marcus's words sank in. He stepped away from the podium, his movements deliberate as he walked toward the center of the room. "Respect is not optional," Marcus said, his tone carrying the weight of authority. "It is the foundation of law enforcement. Without it, we fail, not just as officers, but as human beings. Without it, we lose the trust of the community we swore to protect." He stopped, turning his gaze directly to Carter. The officer stiffened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Officer Carter," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Step forward." The room collectively held its breath. Carter hesitated, his bravado crumbling as he pushed himself off the wall and shuffled toward Marcus. His head was bowed slightly, his earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. "This morning you spat in the face of a man you assumed was powerless," Marcus said, his voice calm but icy. "You disrespected him not only as a human being but as a representation of everything this badge stands for." Carter's mouth opened as if to respond, but Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. "You didn't care who that man was. You didn't care to know. You acted out of arrogance and prejudice, and in doing so, you revealed exactly what is broken in this department." The officers watched in stunned silence, some stealing glances at Carter, others staring at Marcus with a newfound respect, or fear. "Effective immediately," Marcus announced, his voice ringing through the room. "Officer Carter is suspended pending a full internal investigation." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Carter's face turned crimson, his jaw tightening as he avoided the stares of his peers. Marcus turned his attention back to the room, his voice steady but firm. This is not just about one man's mistake. It is about a culture that tolerates, even celebrates this kind of behavior. That culture ends now. The tension in the room was suffocating, but Marcus remained unflinching. He returned to the podium, his presence commanding as he delivered his final words. If you are willing to rise to the standard of integrity, respect, and professionalism that this badge demands, then we will move forward together. But if you are not, then this is not the place for you. With that, Marcus closed the folder on the lectern and stepped back. The officers began to shuffle out, their usual chatter replaced by heavy silence. Carter stormed out without a word, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. Marcus watched them go, his expression unreadable. The battle for change had begun, and the precinct would never be the same. The atmosphere in the precinct was heavy the day after the announcement. The tension from Marcus Taylor's unveiling as the new chief of police still lingered in the air, weaving its way through the halls and echoing in the quiet conversations among officers. No one could escape the shift that had begun. Officer Carter, however, was feeling the brunt of it. Inside Marcus's office, the air was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the unease brewing outside. Marcus sat behind his desk reviewing Carter's personnel file. The reports painted a troubling picture: multiple complaints of excessive force, inappropriate comments, and misconduct, all swept under the rug by the previous leadership. It was a pattern Marcus had seen before, one that could no longer be ignored. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. Carter entered, his usual swagger subdued. His face was pale and his eyes darted nervously around the room. Marcus gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Officer Carter," Marcus said evenly. Carter hesitated before lowering himself into the chair. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Do you know why you're here?" Marcus asked, leaning forward slightly. Carter cleared his throat. "Chief, I know what happened yesterday wasn't my finest moment, but I didn't know it was you. If I had—" Marcus held up a hand, cutting him off. "This isn't about me, Officer Carter. It's about your actions. The fact that you didn't know who I was only makes it worse. It shows that your behavior isn't isolated. It's habitual." Carter's mouth opened as if to argue, but Marcus's steady gaze silenced him. "I've reviewed your record," Marcus continued, tapping the file on his desk. "Excessive force complaints, derogatory comments toward colleagues, and instances of misconduct. Do you deny any of this?" Carter shifted uncomfortably. "Some of those complaints were exaggerated," he muttered. "People don't always understand what it's like on the streets." "Exaggerated or not, they paint a clear picture of someone who operates without accountability," Marcus said, his voice sharp. "And yesterday's incident only confirmed it. You disrespected me. Not as your superior, but as a human being. You assumed I was beneath you, and you acted accordingly." Carter's face reddened. "It was a mistake, Chief. I was having a bad day." "No," Marcus interjected, his tone cutting. "It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. A choice to humiliate someone you thought had no power to fight back. That choice reflects the toxic culture that has been allowed to thrive in this department, and I will not tolerate it." The words hung heavy in the air. Carter stared at the floor, his bravado stripped away. "During this time, I suggest you reflect on whether you're truly fit to wear this badge." Carter looked up, his face a mixture of anger and desperation. "Chief, I've served this department for years. I've made mistakes, sure, but I've also—" "You've had years to make a difference," Marcus interrupted. "But instead, you've contributed to the problem. This isn't just about you, Officer Carter. It's about the message your behavior sends to this department and the community." Marcus stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "You'll be notified when the investigation concludes. Until then, stay away from the precinct." Carter rose slowly, his hands clenched at his sides. He hesitated as if he wanted to argue but thought better of it. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office. Later that day, Marcus called a meeting with the department's leadership team. Captain Harris and several senior officers gathered in the conference room, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. They knew Marcus wasn't here to mince words. "Thank you for coming," Marcus began, standing at the head of the table. "As you're all aware, Officer Carter has been suspended pending an investigation. This decision wasn't made lightly, but it was necessary." The officers exchanged glances but said nothing. "This department has a history of overlooking misconduct," Marcus continued, his tone unwavering. "That ends now. Accountability isn't optional, it's mandatory. If we want to rebuild trust with the community, we must start by holding ourselves to the highest standard." Captain Harris cleared his throat. "Chief, I think we all understand the need for change, but there's bound to be resistance. Some officers might feel—" "Uncomfortable?" Marcus interrupted, fixing Harris with a steady gaze. "Good. Change is supposed to be uncomfortable, but discomfort is no excuse for inaction." Harris nodded, conceding the point. "We're implementing new protocols immediately," Marcus said, turning to the rest of the group. "Bias training, community engagement initiatives, and stricter oversight on complaints. This isn't just about fixing what's broken, it's about preventing it from happening again." One of the senior officers, a woman named Lieutenant Vega, raised her hand. "Chief, what about officers like Carter, those who refuse to adapt?" "They'll face the consequences of their actions," Marcus replied. "But I'm not here to punish for the sake of punishment. If someone is willing to change, I'll give them the opportunity. But if they can't, or won't, they have no place here." The room fell silent. The gravity of Marcus's words was undeniable. For some, it was a wake-up call. For others, it was a challenge. Marcus closed the meeting with a simple statement. "We have a long road ahead, but I believe in this department's ability to rise to the occasion. Let's get to work." In the days that followed, Marcus's leadership began to take shape. He walked the halls regularly, engaging with officers and making his presence known. Some welcomed the change, while others bristled at the new expectations. As Marcus sat in his office one evening reviewing the latest updates on Carter's investigation, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The path he had chosen was not an easy one, but it was necessary. The weight of reform was heavy, but he carried it with pride, knowing that each step forward brought the department closer to the respect and integrity it desperately needed. The ripple effect of Marcus Taylor's leadership began almost immediately. The suspension of Officer Carter sent a shockwave through the precinct. Conversations that had once been laced with bravado and mockery were now quieter, tinged with uncertainty. The officers at Harbor Point Police Department were beginning to understand that the new chief was not here to maintain the status quo. The locker room, once a hub of camaraderie built on inappropriate jokes and veiled insults, had grown quieter. Officer Jessica Vega, a young recruit fresh out of the academy, sat on a bench tying her boots. She glanced around nervously, sensing the tension in the room. Nearby, two senior officers whispered in hushed tones, occasionally glancing her way. Jessica knew why. The day before, she had spoken to Chief Marcus during his routine walk through the precinct. Their conversation, though brief, had been about accountability. "Chief," she had said, stopping him as he passed her desk, I want to do better." Marcus had paused, his steady gaze meeting hers. "That's all I ask, Officer Vega. It starts with you." The interaction had been simple but powerful, planting a seed of determination in her. She had seen the toxic culture in the department but had remained silent, too afraid to speak up. Now, with Marcus at the helm, she felt a glimmer of hope that change was possible. That hope, however, came with a price. Jessica could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, their whispers carrying an unspoken accusation. Traitor. She took a deep breath, standing tall as she exited the locker room. Change was never easy, but she was ready to face it. Not everyone shared Jessica's optimism. In the precinct's break room, Officer Daniel sat slouched in a chair, his expression a mix of frustration and defiance. "This place isn't a police department anymore," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. It's a damn social experiment. A few officers chuckled nervously, but most avoided his gaze. The suspension of Carter had made it clear that Marcus meant business, and no one wanted to be the next example. Captain Harris entered the room, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. "Daniels," he said firmly. "A word." Daniels followed Harris into the hallway, grumbling under his breath. Once out of earshot, Harris turned to him. "You need to get on board, Daniels. Chief Taylor isn't backing down, and neither am I. If you can't adapt, you'll find yourself out the door." Daniels opened his mouth to argue, but stopped himself. The gravity of Harris's tone left no room for debate. Grumbling, he nodded and walked away, though the resentment in his eyes lingered. Meanwhile, Marcus was deep into the investigation of Carter's history. The review revealed a troubling pattern: excessive force incidents, derogatory remarks toward colleagues, and multiple complaints from community members, all buried under mountains of excuses and lack of follow-through. The evidence painted a clear picture of a man who had long operated without accountability. "Unacceptable," Marcus muttered, shaking his head as he read through the files. He picked up the phone and called Captain Harris. "I need the team to see this," he said. "Let's schedule a department-wide briefing." The next morning, officers filed into the briefing room with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Marcus stood at the front, his calm demeanor masking the intensity of his resolve. Captain Harris stood beside him, holding a stack of files. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus began, his voice steady but firm. "This is not a typical briefing. Today we're going to talk about the standards we hold ourselves to as officers of the Harbor Point Police Department." He gestured for Harris to distribute the files. "These are excerpts from Officer Carter's record," Marcus continued. "They highlight a history of misconduct that was ignored for far too long." A murmur rippled through the room as officers flipped through the pages. The evidence was damning, and the mood in the room shifted from curiosity to unease. "This isn't about singling out one person," Marcus said, raising his voice slightly to command attention. "This is about acknowledging a culture that has allowed behavior like this to go unchecked. That ends now." Jessica Vega, sitting near the back, felt a surge of pride. Marcus wasn't just talking, he was acting. The investigation concluded with a formal decision. Carter's suspension would be made permanent. The announcement was met with a mixture of relief and tension. Some officers saw it as a necessary step forward, while others grumbled about what they perceived as an overreach. In his office, Marcus reviewed the final paperwork with Captain Harris. "This is the right decision," Harris said, his voice firm. Marcus nodded. "It's not just about Carter. It's about setting a precedent. We can't rebuild trust without accountability." As the days passed, the changes Marcus implemented began to take root. Mandatory training sessions on implicit bias and community engagement were rolled out. Officers like Jessica Vega embraced the opportunity, eager to grow and learn. Others, like Daniels, resisted, their skepticism evident in their body language and sarcastic remarks during training sessions. But Marcus was undeterred. Each small victory, a positive interaction with a community member, an officer admitting their mistakes, was a step forward. One afternoon, Marcus received a knock on his office door. It was Jessica. "Chief," she said, her voice steady, "I wanted to thank you. I've been scared to speak up for a long time, but seeing what you've done here has given me the courage to try." Marcus smiled. "Thank you for saying that, Officer Vega. It's not about me. It's about all of us. Change starts with each of us deciding to do better." Jessica nodded, a newfound confidence in her eyes. She left the office, and Marcus leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction. The road ahead was still long, but moments like these reminded him why he had taken the job in the first place. Change was happening, and it was worth every step. Marcus Taylor knew that repairing the fractured trust between the Harbor Point Police Department and its community would require more than speeches and policy changes. It demanded action, visibility, and a commitment to engage with the very people who had lost faith in those who were sworn to protect them. The road to redemption was long, but Marcus was determined to walk every step. On a sunny Saturday morning, Marcus arrived at Harbor Point's Central Park for the department's first organized community outreach event under his leadership. Tents lined the grassy field, offering activities, free food, and spaces for open dialogue between officers and residents. Families wandered the park, and children laughed as they played on the nearby playground. Marcus had insisted on attending in plain clothes, wanting to connect with the community not as a distant figure of authority but as a neighbor. He wore a simple button-up shirt and jeans, his badge clipped to his belt but barely visible. The turnout was larger than expected, a mix of curious residents, skeptical onlookers, and hopeful families eager to see if change was genuinely underway. Marcus strolled through the event, stopping to greet attendees, his warm smile disarming even the most doubtful. Near a tent hosting a face-painting station, a young boy caught his eye. The boy, no older than 10, lingered near the edge of the crowd, his wide eyes filled with curiosity and a hint of mistrust. Marcus crouched to meet his gaze. "Hi there," he said gently. "I'm Marcus. What's your name?" The boy hesitated before answering. "Jaden." "It's nice to meet you, Jaden," Marcus said, extending his hand. The boy shook it tentatively, his small hand dwarfed by Marcus's. "Are you having fun?" Jaden nodded but didn't smile. "My dad says the police don't care about us," he said softly, glancing at Marcus's badge. The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He took a deep breath, keeping his expression calm. "I understand why your dad might feel that way," he said honestly. "But I want you to know that I'm here to change that. If you ever need help, you can come to me, okay?" Jaden looked at him for a long moment before nodding again, this time with a small, hesitant smile. Marcus ruffled the boy's hair lightly before standing, his heart heavy but resolute. This was why he was here. Back at the precinct, Marcus had implemented mandatory training sessions on implicit bias and community relations. The sessions were met with mixed reactions. Some officers approached them earnestly, while others grumbled about political correctness and the waste of time. One morning, Officer Daniels was particularly vocal during a session. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath as the instructor discussed the impact of stereotypes in policing. "We're here to catch criminals, not sing Kumbaya." Marcus, who was observing from the back of the room, stepped forward. "Daniels," he said, his voice calm but firm, "what's ridiculous is thinking we can serve this community without understanding it. If you're not willing to learn, you're not willing to grow." Daniels crossed his arms but said nothing more. Marcus didn't need him to agree. As weeks turned into months, Marcus began to see small but significant changes. Officers started addressing residents with more respect, listening instead of assuming. At traffic stops, they explained their actions more clearly. Complaints from the community began to decrease, and a few residents even expressed appreciation for the new tone of the department. At a town hall meeting, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hernandez stood up to speak. "I've lived in Harbor Point for 50 years, she said, her voice steady but emotional. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I can trust the police again. Thank you, Chief Taylor." The room erupted in applause, and Marcus felt a lump in his throat. Moments like these reminded him why the fight was worth it. One afternoon, Marcus was invited to speak at a youth center in a historically marginalized neighborhood. The center's director, Ms. Carter, greeted him warmly but didn't hide her skepticism. "Chief Taylor, I appreciate you coming," she said, "but the kids here have seen too much to trust easily. You've got your work cut out for you." Marcus nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less." In the center's gymnasium, he addressed a group of teenagers, many of whom sat with their arms crossed, their faces blank. Marcus shared his story, growing up in a neighborhood like theirs, his struggles as a black man in law enforcement, and his commitment to changing the system from within. By the end of his talk, the room was quieter. A young girl raised her hand. "Do you really think it can change?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope and doubt. Marcus met her gaze. "I know it can," he said firmly, "but I can't do it alone. Change takes all of us." As Marcus walked through the precinct one evening, he noticed something different. Officers were laughing and chatting, but this time it wasn't at someone's expense. The air felt lighter, the camaraderie genuine. He paused in the hallway, watching as Jessica Vega helped a rookie officer navigate a tricky case. Nearby, Daniel sat quietly at his desk, reviewing paperwork without his usual scowl. The precinct wasn't perfect, there were still challenges, still resistance, but it was undeniably different. That night, Marcus attended a meeting with Harbor Point's City Council. He presented data showing the precinct's progress, reduced complaints, increased community engagement, and improved morale among the officers. One council member leaned forward, a smile on her face. "Chief Taylor, I think we're finally starting to see the changes this city has needed for a long time. Thank you." Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with pride. The work was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a sense of momentum. The divide between the police and the community was beginning to close, one step at a time. A year had passed since Marcus Taylor stepped into the precinct of Harbor Point, determined to transform a fractured department and restore the trust of a wary community. As he sat in his office on a quiet Friday evening, he reflected on the tumultuous journey that had brought the precinct to where it was today. The once toxic culture of the department had undergone a noticeable transformation. The precinct buzzed with a new energy, an energy built on mutual respect, collaboration, and a shared commitment to serve the people of Harbor Point with integrity. The changes were visible everywhere. The break room, which had once been a hotbed of cynical banter and exclusionary cliques, now hosted open discussions about community events and officer well-being. The station walls, once adorned with fading bulletins, were now filled with photos from outreach programs, commendations for acts of kindness, and messages of gratitude from community members. Marcus often walked the halls during shift changes, greeting officers by name and sharing brief but meaningful exchanges. Many of them, once skeptical of his vision, now sought him out for advice, feedback, or simply to share their successes. Officer Carter, the man whose hostility had sparked one of Marcus's toughest challenges, had left the precinct after his suspension became permanent. For months, his name was whispered in the halls, a cautionary tale of what could happen to those who refused to adapt. However, Marcus's decision to offer Carter a path toward redemption had not been in vain. After leaving the precinct, Carter sought therapy and enrolled in workshops on emotional intelligence and bias training. One day he reached out to Marcus with an unexpected message. "Chief Taylor," the email began, "I owe you an apology and a thank you. Losing my job forced me to confront who I had become, and while it hasn't been easy, I'm working to be better. I hope one day to be able to contribute to the kind of department you're building." Marcus read the email with a mix of relief and pride. Change, he realized, wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about planting seeds, even in the unlikeliest of soil. The streets of Harbor Point felt different now. The wary glances once exchanged between residents and officers were being replaced with nods of acknowledgement and even occasional smiles. Marcus had implemented regular coffee with a cop events, where officers met with residents in informal settings to discuss concerns and share ideas. One morning, Marcus attended one such event at a local cafe. A young man named Luis approached him carrying a small child in his arms. "Chief Taylor," he said, "I just wanted to say thank you. A year ago, I wouldn't have trusted the police to help me with anything, but now I feel like you're really here for us." Marcus smiled, shaking Luis's hand. "That means more than you know, Luis. We're committed to keeping it that way." At a city council meeting, Marcus presented a year-end report summarizing the precinct's progress. Complaints about officer misconduct had dropped significantly, community satisfaction scores had risen, and the department's new recruits were more diverse and better trained in de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. The council members, who had initially been divided on Marcus's appointment, were now unanimous in their praise. "Chief Taylor," one councilwoman said, "you've shown us what leadership looks like. Harbor Point is lucky to have you." Marcus thanked them humbly but reminded them that the work was far from over. "True change," he said, "is a constant process. We've taken the first steps, but it's up to all of us to keep moving forward." One evening, as Marcus prepared to leave the precinct, a knock on his office door startled him. He looked up to see Jaden, the young boy he had met at the community event months ago, standing nervously in the doorway with his father. "Jaden," Marcus greeted warmly, standing to shake the boy's hand. "It's good to see you again. What brings you here?" Jaden's father, a tall man with a serious expression, spoke first. "Chief, my son insisted we come see you. He wanted to thank you for what you said to him that day in the park." Jaden stepped forward, holding a drawing in his small hands. "This is for you," he said shyly, handing it to Marcus. Marcus unfolded the paper to reveal a crayon drawing of a police station, with officers smiling alongside children. At the center of the picture was a tall figure wearing a badge that read, "Chief Marcus." Tears pricked Marcus's eyes as he looked at the boy. "Thank you, Jaden. This is the best thing anyone has ever given me." As Marcus stood in the precinct's main hallway later that night, he watched as officers ended their shifts. Laughter echoed through the building. Not the cruel laughter of exclusion, but the warm camaraderie of a team united by purpose. He thought about how far they had come. There were still challenges ahead, still minds to change and trust to build. But the precinct was no longer the broken place he had walked into a year ago. It was a place of hope, accountability, and possibility. As he walked back to his office, Marcus passed a bulletin board featuring a new slogan he had recently introduced. "Harbor Point PD, where respect leads." He smiled. The journey was far from over, but for the first time it felt like they were on the right path. Marcus sat at his desk, Jaden's drawing pinned to the wall beside him, and began drafting his next plan for community engagement. Change was never easy, but it was always worth the fight, and he was ready to keep fighting. This story isn't just about what happened here in Harbor Point, it's about the power of accountability and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. Change isn't easy, but it's worth every step when you lead with integrity and respect. Remember, every action we take has the potential to inspire, to uplift, and to create a better world. Thank you for watching, and if this story moved you, please hit the subscribe button. Join us as we continue sharing stories of resilience, transformation, and hope. Your support helps spread messages that can make a real impact. Let's keep building a world where justice and compassion are at the heart of every community.